The horrific story of Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Even Netflix did a mini-series about him. The subject of a new Netflix true crime offering was a quiet, isolated farmer to the outside world in the 1950s. But he was having a grisly nightmare house that would go on to inspire horror movies. Ed Gein, who became infamous for crimes committed in rural Plainfield, Wisconsin, admitted to the killing of 2 women and stealing corpses from graves. His facade unraveled in late 1957 when a local hardware store owner went missing, leading authorities to Gein's door. In his farmhouse, they discovered her mutilated body along with the body parts of several others. He had fashioned furniture and clothing out of human skin and other remains, which he kept around his house of horrors. The saga is recorded in the newly released Monsters, the Ed Gein story produced by Ryan Murphy, the latest installment in the series that previously chronicled Jeffrey Dahmer and the Menendez brothers. The series took some liberties to dramatically retell Gein's story. But here's what we know about the true shocking story of the so-called Butcher of Plainfield. There's a picture of Gein. Gein was born in August of 1906, to parents George and Augusta Gein. He had one brother, Henry. The Gein family moved to the farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, when Ed Gein was young, when they lived in mostly isolation. Ed Gein attended school but was said to be punished by his mother if he tried to make friends. He grew up in a strict and religious household. Ed Gein later told investigators he and his brother were abused by his father, who died in 1940 of heart failure. 4 years later, Henry Gein also died. Henry Gein's death in the series is portrayed as murder by his brother. In real life, investigators ruled out foul play at the time, and Ed Gein never admitted having a role in the death. Ed Gein idolized his mother and took care of her after she had a stroke. Soon after Henry Gein's death, she died after having a second stroke in 1945. Gein was first arrested in 1957 when authorities were investigating the disappearance of Bernice Worden, who owned a hardware store. Investigators found a receipt for a purchase made by Gein, along with blood in the store. Leading them to Gein and his property. In a shed, they found Worden's mutilated body, hanging from hooks with her head severed. Gein, 51 at the time, admitted to killing Worden. Inside his farmhouse, investigators found Worden's head and a slew of other night marsh discoveries: human skulls, a lampshade made from human skin, more than a half a dozen masks made from the flesh of female faces, a wearable corset made from the skin of a female torso, and more. They also found remains belonging to Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had been missing for 3 years. Gein also admitted to killing Hogan. Other body parts Gein said he got from robbing at least 9 graves in a cemetery. Gein reportedly told investigators the desire to kill and keep human flesh was driven by his deep connection with his mother, and a desire to become more like a woman by wearing their skin. His grisly crimes were loose inspiration for some of the most notorious horror films, including Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Gein was charged in Worden's murder, pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and found unfit to stand trial in his first trial. He was sent to psychiatric facilities in a second trial in 1968. He was found guilty of murder, but a follow-up proceedings was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was never tried for Hogan's death or for the grave robbers he also confessed to. Gein died in 1984 at the age of 77 of respiratory failure related to lung cancer while still at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Wisconsin. Up next is Law and Crime speaking to a guy who writes books. And they're going over what was real in the Netflix series and what wasn't. His final days and why he has an unmarked grave. The Monster Season 3 subject Ed Gein died at age 77 on July 26 of 1984. Netflix is revisiting the case of Ed Gein in Season 3 of Monster, Ryan Murphy's true crime anthology. Known for crimes that shocked 1950s Wisconsin and later inspired horror classics like Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Gein remains one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history. After his grisly crimes were uncovered, Gein spent his final years in psychiatric confinement, far from the farmhouse that once horrified the nation. How did he die? He was arrested in 1957 and institutionalized. A police raid uncovered gruesome evidence. The Wisconsin native filled his home with body parts, including preserved organs and genitalia. The findings fueled speculation about necrophilia, but he denied the allegation. The media then dubbed him the Butcher of Plainfield and the Plainfield Ghoul. He died in 1984 from cancer. Following his arrest, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and declared mentally unfit for trial. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminal Insane, then transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, where he remained for the rest of his life. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reported that Gein pled not guilty, claiming insanity, and avoided a trial. Eventually, though, he was ruled competent and convicted of Worden's murder during a second trial in 1968. After he was found guilty, he continued to live under psychiatric care. He died at age 77 on July 26, 1984, from respiratory failure caused by cancer. He was buried next to his mom and brother. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery in the family plot next to his mother and brother. But even in death, the public didn't forget about him. Visitors began chipping away pieces of his headstone, taking them as souvenirs. The damage became so severe that caretakers struggled to maintain the site. In June of 2000, Gein's 150-pound gravestone vanished from Plainfield Cemetery. Authorities suspected it might surface online as other Gein-related items, including dirt from his property, and had previously been sold on eBay. Washura County authorities initially suspected that the gravestone theft might have been linked to the occult activity. Gein's headstone was never returned to the cemetery. Today, Gein's grave remains unmarked. The grassy patch between his mother and brother is all that remains of his final resting place. Ed Gein's crimes inspired Psycho, among other movies. Gein's story has inspired countless books, documentaries, and films. Robert Bloch's 1959 novel Psycho, based loosely on Gein's crimes, was adapted into Alfred Hitchcock's iconic 1960 film. Later, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Silence of the Lambs drew from Gein's grotesque legacy. Most recently, Netflix Season 3 of the Monster anthology focuses on Gein, reigniting interest in his life and the cultural impact of his crimes. The show stars Charlie Hunnam as Gein and Laurie Metcalf as his brother Augusta.
In why we need stories about monsters. And at some point in my researches on another book, I came across the fact, which was not widely known at the time, I mean, I was unaware of it, that both Hitchcock's Psycho and Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre had both been inspired by the same true-life criminal. So I began to investigate that, thought it might make an intriguing subject for a book, and proceeded to do a great deal of research into the story, traveling to Plainfield, speaking to Gein's neighbors and people who had grown up with him, and interviewing psychiatrists who had treated him and so on. And the result was my book, Deviant.
And let me say this, there is a tremendous interest in Ed Gein. I mean, even if you look at the Netflix series right now, I think it's #1 on the charts. You've watched a majority of it. we're going to get into specific points about whether they got it right or not. But from your opinion, two questions I have. One, do you think that they got his story right, generally speaking? We'll get into specifics. And two, there has been a backlash on these kind of shows that would arguably glamorize or dramatize a killer, and we saw it in the Menendez brothers. We're seeing it here. Do you have a concern with these kinds of shows where you're blending horror with entertainment? So let's start here. How much of it do you think is actually correct? How much of it's accurate? And do you have a concern with a show like this?
I would say that 90% of it is inaccurate. I was actually quite taken aback by the kinds of liberties the writer, Ian Brennan, took with the Gein story. There's so much in the show that's pure fabrication and has nothing to do with the realities of the case. In its broad outline, it's accurate. I mean, Gein was this loner, overly attached to his mother, who became a grave robber and murdered 2 local women. But aside from a few bare facts like that, there was pretty much nothing in all 8 episodes that seemed to me to bear any reality to the historical facts.
That's interesting that you say that, and I want to dive into that. But you mentioned his mother, Augusta. It's often portrayed as the key to his psyche. From your research, was that really the root of Ed Gein, his psychology? Was it just part of a larger picture? Let's start right there.
Well, it was certainly a major part of his psychology. I mean, it appears that after her death, when he was living alone in this ramshackle farmhouse with no electricity or running water, he grew so lonely for her company that he attempted to dig up her corpse and bring it back home to me, but he was unable to reach the coffin, primarily because the soil in that part of Wisconsin is very sandy, and many coffins are interred within concrete vaults. That seems to have been the case with Augusta. So then he began to dig up the bodies of middle-aged and elderly women who might have reminded him in some way of his mother and bring those back to his farmhouse. Apparently, when he ran out of suitable corpses in the local graveyard, he decided to make a couple of them. So he murdered these 2 women, I would say executed them, and brought their bodies back home. So, a lot of the actions that have made him so notorious and really unique in the annals of American crime had to do with this attempt to resurrect his mother.
And before we get into the specifics of the show, you raise a larger point. There are people who say, there are accounts who say he's not the conventional serial killer, as we would know, more of a grave robber, like you said, who crossed the line. Would you agree with that? He's not a traditional serial killer as we, typically think?
Yeah, I've been saying that for a while.
Okay.
In fact, the new edition of my book, which you can see over my shoulder, I wrote an afterword, and the first thing I talk about is the fact that Gein was not a serial killer. In fact, the phrase serial killer doesn't even appear in my book. The phrase serial killer was coined to describe specifically what used to be called lust murderers, that is to say, psychopathic sex killers like John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy, who derived their sick pleasure from abducting, torturing, and then murdering victims, and usually having an orgasm when they finally kill them. Gein was not a sex killer. The 2 women he killed, as I said, he just shot in the head. I mean, he executed them. He wasn't interested in torturing them. He was interested in bringing their corpses back home so he could mutilate them in the way he'd like to do. So yeah, Geen was one thing about the show that I had difficulty with is that it presents Geen as this sort of prototypical serial killer who inspired all these other serial killers. I'm sure all the serial killers they show at the end of the show had no idea who Ed Gein was. Again, among other things, he was a pretty obscure figure. I immodestly take some credit for bringing him into the larger public awareness. But he was not a serial killer.
No, and I appreciate you emphasizing that point. Let's get into some of the storylines in this, and we'll start with what you just said. How Ed Gein would sneak into these graveyards at night under moonlight, dig up the coffins, harvest the skin, the bones to make these macabre artifacts. From that depiction in the show, that aspect of it, is it all accurate or no?
That part of it's pretty accurate from what I saw. The most inaccurate part is the scene in which we see Geen having intercourse with one of the bodies. It's very unclear if he ever had any sexual activities with the bodies. There's some suggestion that he might have at one point tried or thought of it, but he wasn't particularly interested in.
Right.
The term necrophilia was originally coined to describe a early 19th century French military man. He was known as Sergeant Bertrand, who would go into graveyards at night, dig up corpses until he found one of a recently buried attractive young woman, and have sex with the corpse. I always think of Geen, I know this sounds somewhat flippant, but, as a peculiarly American kind of necrophile who didn't want to have sex with corpses. He wanted to use their bodies as raw material for his home improvement projects.
Yeah, that's definitely the way to put it. All right, let's talk about this babysitter aspect. So this claim that he was a babysitter, the series shows several eerie scenes where he can be sitting on the floor, telling children stories, the camera slowly revealing the horror that is waiting back home. Do the historical accounts suggest, A, that he was a babysitter and that he was creepy or strange around children, or is that an invention of the show?
He was a babysitter, and the fact that he was a babysitter says something about the way he was perceived in the community. He was just seen as maybe slightly simple-minded, but friendly and obliging person who would run errands for neighbors and so on. So apparently he did do some babysitting, but he actually related very well to children. When I did my research, I spoke to a young man. I guess he was in his 40s, maybe at the time I spoke to him, who had been Gein's nearest neighbor and had been in Gein's house, who spoke warmly of Gein. Gein apparently related better to children than he did to grown-ups. So all that stuff about Gein terrorizing these kids is just one of many fabrications in the show.
Talk about grown-ups. We mentioned it earlier, Bernice Worden. So this hardware store owner who was killed by Gein, found mutilated in his shed. The Netflix series kind of portrays this romantic relationship, right, between the two of them. And in Monster, his relationship with her, and she's portrayed by Leslie Manville, it's complex, it's longing, it's elements of resentment, it's delusion. The show builds them into these kind of tragic opposites, right? She's a widow trying to move on. He's this lonely man yearning for a maternal figure. There's a lot of emotional tension. What is accurate about the relationship? What is not? Do you think that they took creative liberties with the romantic aspect?
Nothing is accurate about it. I mean, it's complete fabrication. Bernice Worden kind of a grandmotherly kind of person who ran the local hardware store. Geen did seem to apparently have some interest in her. Uh, he sort of joked. Well, it was hard to know if he was joking or not, but at some point he asked her to go if she would go roller skating with him. Roller skating was a favorite activity of his. But apart from that, they had no relationship whatsoever. Somebody sent me recently a posting online that the Warden family is quite upset over how the show depicts their relationship. There's no truth to it at all.
That's common. We see that in a lot of these shows. People who are portrayed, the family members, particularly of those who are no longer here, they are quite vocal about how it's being portrayed. Because for a lot of people, this is going to be a show, their first introduction to Ed Gein. They may take everything as true, which is why, again, Harold, I'm so happy to have you here to break it down and separate fact from fiction. There are darker subplots here. And one of the things here is this tie with Gein to a real unsolved case, the 1953 disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, a 15-year-old babysitter from La Crosse, Wisconsin. She vanished on October 24th. She was babysitting a family's 20-month-old daughter. In the show, in Monster, detectives suspect that Ed Gein, and he even hallucinates about Evelyn, who's played by Addison Rae. In real life, Harold, what's the story? Were there ever any police leads linking him to Evelyn Hartley's disappearance?
Well, when the horrors in Gein's farmhouse were first uncovered, all these body parts, the immediate assumption was that they had come from murder victims, that Gein was, in fact, a serial killer, although that phrase didn't exist back then. They probably would have called it a mass murderer. There was no suspicion at the time that he was a grave robber. So after his arrest, as often happens in such cases, all these police officials descended on Plainfield, hoping they could close out these cold cases by pinning them on Gein. But there is absolutely no evidence that Gein had anything to do with Evelyn Hartley's disappearance. And I am firmly of the belief that he was not responsible for it, because, again, that wasn't Gein's MO. He wasn't interested in abducting and sexually abusing and torturing young women. He was strictly interested in somehow both trying to resurrect his mother, bring his mother back to live with him, while at the same time, the psychologists who examined Gein felt justifiably that he had these very ambivalent feelings towards his mother, which he never consciously admitted to.
Right.
This was a woman who so dominated and obviously in many ways helped destroy his life. He both worshipped her, but on a level he was not aware of, he harbored all these homicidal feelings towards her. So he was bringing back these bodies, both in an effort to, as I say, resurrect her, but also, to enact these terrible mutilations on her. But in any case, the Evelyn Hartley thing, the part in the show where he kills these two hunters and dismembers them with a chainsaw, there's so much in the show that is absolute make-believe.
Right.
That he helped solve the Ted Bundy case and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that one. But since we're talking family, there's another big part of this lingering mystery about what happened to Ed Gein's brother, Henry, is the idea that he killed him, right? So remember, we told you earlier that Henry died in a fire under what was deemed suspicious circumstances, but Monster portrays his death in an interesting way. In the show, Ed Gein is seen killing his brother during an argument about their mother, striking him in a rage, staging the death as a brush fire accident. That is one of the series' most striking scenes. Any aspect of that seems to match up?
Well, there is a scene in my book that I based on something Geen must have said, in which he and Henry, Henry is sort of warning Ed about the mother. But there's no evidence that Ed killed Henry. My own feeling is, again, that he did not kill Henry, that they were both fighting this brush fire, and that Henry, which was, not a necessarily uncommon thing, died from asphyxiation or had a heart attack. And he apparently, when he collapsed, he apparently hit his head on a rock. Again, after Geen's, atrocities were uncovered, there was all this talk about his having murdered Henry, that it was a Cain and Abel situation. But as far as my own opinion goes, based on my research, he did not kill Henry.
Okay. All right. Look, you mentioned Ted Bundy. I was going to mention it later. Let's talk about it actually right now. We'll get into some more of the killings that were portrayed in the show. There is a connection in the show, right? So the series ends with this kind of surreal twist that Ed Gein, institutionalized but lucid, is consulting with a young FBI agent about a new killer at the time named Ted Bundy. That is a big development in the show. My understanding is the timelines don't even match up, even if this were true, right? I mean, did he help with the investigation to Ted Bundy at all? No, right?
No. Yeah, and all those scenes at the end where you have, as I think I might have said before, these serial killers, Richard Speck, Bruto, so I forget his first name, citing Ed as this inspiration. It's ridiculous. First of all, Ed was not a serial killer. And second of all, it's very doubtful that any of those figures had any idea who Gein was at that time. So the notion of the FBI consulting him in their hunt for Ted Bundy, I kind of admire that level of imaginative fantasy, but has no basis in reality.
And going back to the idea of what killings were actually tied to him and not, and what's complete fiction, there is a part where we see Ed Gein, years after being locked away, kills a nurse inside the psychiatric ward. Like, the monster never really stopped, right? It's brutal. It is shocking. It leaves you thinking that he was still dangerous, even under supervision. Did that actually happen?
No. I know apparently Gein, who was living much better in the institution than he had ever lived before, with other people and actually being served, fairly decent meals, as opposed to eating reheated baked beans out of the top of a human skull, and had, nice surroundings, well, relative to where he had lived before. Was just an easygoing model prisoner, very cheerful, very friendly, conducting. He had these pen pal correspondents that he developed warm relationships with. So again, yeah, made up.
Made up. Okay. And you put the murders to the side. Going back to romance, there's another part that we got to talk about where we meet Adeline Watkins. I believe she's played by Susanna Son. She's this waitress, this aspiring singer who supposedly falls for him. And she visits him in secret after his mother dies. And for a few episodes, it's almost like this tragic love story, her trying to save him wanting connection, being too far gone. You could say it's tender, it's unsettling. It gives the show this weird emotional break in the middle of all of the horror, in the middle of everything we're seeing. Any aspect of that's real? I mean, what do we know about her?
Well, there was an Adeline Watkins. First of all, short answer, no, none of that is real.
Okay.
So Adeline Watkins did live in Plainfield. If you see photographs of her, and I don't mean to be cruel, but she bears a striking resemblance to Margaret Hamilton in The Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West. she apparently, I mean, she might have gone roller skating once with Gein. It's a little unclear, but evidently she was a something of a publicity hound. And when the media descended on Plainfield after the discovery of Gein's crimes, she put herself forward as Ed Gein's girlfriend. She actually later retracted all that, but they barely had any kind of relationship. And as I say, she was by no means, you know, resembled the actress who plays her in the show.
I want to circle back to something that you mentioned before, the legacy of Ed Gein. You talked about whether or not anyone was inspired by what he did, and you're seeing Hollywood, whether it was Psycho or whether it was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the show kind of makes, or Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill, the woman suit. It seems there was an inspiration from this, or maybe not. I mean, I think the Netflix series plays with that idea in the series. They weave in little nods to these directors. How much of that connection is real? And I guess, how much has Ed Gein shaped Hollywood horror the way that Netflix suggests? And it goes back to a larger theme, right? If people are watching this and people are trying to understand what they should take away from this story, what should they? I mean, what is his inspiration? What is his connection? What should people look for in this series, and what should they not look for?
Well, where the series goes wrong again is suggesting that Ed's main legacy was, is this pioneering serial killer. Ed does have an important legacy. He actually is an important cultural figure. And the reason for that is, I always tell people I'm a baby boomer, and I grew up in the 1950s, and I spent or misspent a great deal of childhood, watching all these horror movies and stuff. And before Psycho, all the monsters in popular culture came from other places. Dracula comes from Transylvania, and there's the Wolfman of London, and the Mummy from Egypt, or Martian invaders. What Psycho did in the character of Norman Bates was create the first really all-American monster, and also was really the precursor of the later slasher movie genre. And insofar as Ed stands behind Norman Bates, which he does, most people know Psycho justifiably through Hitchcock's masterpiece, but Psycho is based on a book by the horror writer Robert Bloch. And in the book, when Norman is arrested, he compares himself to Ed Gein. So Gein is the direct inspiration for Psycho. And insofar as Psycho, again, Americanized the genre of horror, you could say that Ed did have this major cultural impact.
And when we go back to this Netflix show, I'm assuming you would say, take everything with a grain of salt, listen to this episode of Sidebar where we correct fact from fiction, but I think you would agree the title, Monster, that would be accurate to describe Ed Gein.
I would say you should take it with a whole salt shaker full of salt. Not just
Fair enough.
And but yes, there's no question that Gein was a monster, although many people who have read my book, and I also did a graphic novel with the great comic book artist named Eric Powell called Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Done? People have read that. It's possible to feel, given the horrendous conditions he lived under and the kinds of abuse he suffered at the hands of his mother, possible to feel a small degree of sympathy for Gein, which, of course, it's not possible to feel, for John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy.
Right.
Those people were pure evil. Gein was not evil in that way.
Well, I encourage everybody to check out your work on this, including that graphic novel, including the book Deviant, The Shocking True Story of Ed Gein.